Would you have dared to walk the streets of New York in 1975? Not the New York of Instagrammable skylines or luxury condos. This was a city on the verge of collapse. A place where entire neighborhoods burned. Police handed out leaflets warning tourists not to leave their hotels, and garbage piled up as high as the crime rate. The Big Apple had rotted from the inside. Banks stopped lending. The government said, "Drop dead." Fear ruled the subways, and every corner felt like it could be your last. This wasn't a movie. This was New York City. Real, unfiltered, terrifying. In this video, we go back to the heart of the chaos, understand the moment when the greatest city in the world almost fell for good. In 1975, New York City stood at the edge of an abyss. The skyline still glittered at night, but behind the iconic silhouette, the city was bleeding out. After decades of financial mismanagement, over-reliance on borrowing, and ballooning social spending, the city's budget was unsustainable. By the spring of that year, New York had racked up over $13 billion in debt and was just days away from declaring bankruptcy. The middle class had already begun its mass exodus to the suburbs. Businesses followed, taking with them thousands of jobs and millions in tax revenue. The manufacturing industry had collapsed. White-collar jobs were moving elsewhere, and unemployment was surging. The tax base shrank dramatically, but the city's expenses only grew. New York was still paying for ambitious welfare programs, housing subsidies, public hospitals, and a massive public workforce it could no longer afford. Mayor Abraham Beame, a bookkeeper by trade, found himself in a nightmare with no easy solutions. His administration slashed budgets, froze wages, and laid off thousands of municipal workers, including police officers, firefighters, and sanitation employees. But it wasn't enough. The banks stopped lending. Panic set in. Garbage piled up in the streets. Schools operated without heating, and entire neighborhoods were left in a state of neglect. To make things worse, when the city turned to the federal government for a bailout, President Gerald Ford said no. In what became an infamous moment of urban humiliation, the New York Daily News ran the headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." The message was loud and clear: New York was on its own. In a desperate bid to avoid complete collapse, the state created the Municipal Assistance Corporation, a financial watchdog led by hard-nosed banker Felix Rohatyn. The MAC imposed harsh austerity measures: tuition at City University, pension freezes, job cuts, and sweeping structural reforms. Even then, the turnaround was not immediate. Teachers used their retirement savings to purchase the city's bonds and keep it afloat. Public workers made painful sacrifices. The financial elite struck fragile deals to delay ruin. By the end of 1975, New York had narrowly avoided default, but it emerged wounded, angry, and deeply mistrustful. What had once been the most powerful city in America had become a cautionary tale. And for the people living in it, fear and uncertainty became the new normal. And as is often the case in most parts of the world, when the economy fails, so does security. By the mid-70s, New York City was not just broke, it was broken. With public services slashed and the economy in freefall, the streets began to reflect the city's unraveling soul. Crime was no longer an occasional threat, it was a constant companion. Walking alone at night wasn't just risky, it was reckless. People locked their doors during the day, subways emptied after dark. Even Times Square, once a symbol of American ambition, had become a neon-lit wasteland of porno theaters, hustlers, and dealers. In 1975, the city saw over 1,600 murders, rape, assault, and robbery surged to levels never seen before. Police presence was visibly thinner. Many officers had been laid off, and those who remained were underpaid and demoralized. Whole neighborhoods were considered no-go zones, places even the cops hesitated to enter without backup. From Harlem to the South Bronx, to parts of Brooklyn and the Lower East Side, street crime was woven into the fabric of daily life. The subways, once a symbol of urban ingenuity, became rolling metal prisons. Graffiti covered every surface, not just as artistic rebellion, but as a reflection of total disorder. Muggings on the trains were common. Commuters learned to sit near the conductor's booth or ride together for protection. If you missed the last train, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It could be dangerous. Pimps, pushers, and gangs controlled street corners, and many communities were left to fend for themselves. The sound of breaking glass, sirens in the distance, and shouting in the alleyways became the nighttime soundtrack of the city. The fear wasn't just physical, it was psychological. There was a growing belief that New York was dying, that the great American city was no longer governable, no longer safe. Tourism plummeted. Families who could afford to leave did, and those who stayed adapted by avoiding certain blocks, by carrying cash in decoy wallets, or by simply learning to live with the fear. It wasn't paranoia if the danger was real. And in 1975, danger was very, very real. New York wasn't just struggling, it felt like it was under siege. And for many residents, survival was the only goal. But the worst was yet to come. If crime was the face of New York's breakdown, then urban decay was its skeleton rotting from the inside out. By 1975, whole sections of the city looked like they had survived a war. Buildings stood gutted by fire or left to crumble. Sidewalks cracked underfoot, and streets were strewn with garbage. The city's physical collapse was everywhere, and it was impossible to ignore. In the South Bronx, the image was apocalyptic. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble. Arson had become both a weapon and a way out. Landlords, unable to make money from rent-controlled buildings, often chose to burn them down for insurance money. And sometimes, desperate tenants did the same to force relocation or gain a payout. Firehouses were closing, firefighters were overwhelmed, and response times stretched dangerously long. Residents began to expect the worst not if the building would burn. But when? Brooklyn and Harlem weren't much better. Trash piled high due to sanitation cuts. Streetlights flickered out and were left unrepaired. Potholes became craters. Subway stations reeked of urine and rot. The feeling was clear. The city had given up. And in return, many citizens too. Public housing complexes became symbols of failed policy. Poorly maintained and overcrowded, they bred hopelessness and tension. Infrastructure projects were abandoned halfway through. Parks went untended. Schools were underfunded and understaffed. And all around, a creeping sense of neglect settled in like dust on windowsills, thick, gray, and permanent. New York had become a city in retreat, a place where the government had essentially surrendered large portions of its territory. Landlords fled, small businesses shuttered, the middle class escaped to the suburbs. And what remained was a skeleton crew of survivors. Those who had nowhere else to go, and those who were simply too stubborn to leave. The visual language of the city changed: brick walls covered in graffiti, empty lots overgrown with weeds, street corners lit by burning trash cans. The classic skyline stood in contrast to the devastation below. New York was still iconic, but now it was broken. This wasn't just economic decline. This was urban abandonment, happening in real time, on a scale no other American city had seen before. As we have gone throughout the video, by 1975, fear wasn't just in the air, it had settled deep into the bones of New York City. It wasn't paranoia if it was real. Muggings, rapes, and violent assaults weren't just occasional headlines. They were part of the daily rhythm. The average New Yorker didn't just experience fear, they adapted to it. It shaped their routines, their routes, even the way they walked. Look straight ahead, don't make eye contact, keys between the fingers just in case. The city's psychological state was one of hypervigilance. Taking the subway at night was considered reckless. Walking home alone? Dangerous. Even during the day, certain neighborhoods were strictly off-limits, and every Oneric, poor, black, white, felt it. The city's mood had curdled. People were angrier, more guarded. Trust was rare, and optimism even rarer. For many, the government's abandonment triggered a deep sense of betrayal. This was the richest city in the world, and yet entire communities had been left to rot. That betrayal fostered resentment. And out of that resentment, something else began to grow. Identity, resistance, self-definition. If the city wasn't going to save you, you had to save yourself or at least make some noise before you went down. That noise became culture. In the Bronx, amidst the ashes, hip-hop was being born. Not in polished studios, but on broken sidewalks and in burned-out buildings. DJs spun records off stolen electricity. MCs rapped about their lives with gritty honesty. This wasn't entertainment. It was survival through expression. In downtown Manhattan, punks took over the Bowery. CBGB was more than a venue, it was a scream of defiance. The art scene turned raw and political. Graffiti artists bombed subway cars as a way of reclaiming public space. It wasn't pretty, but it was real. It belonged to them. In 1975, New York was a pressure cooker of fear and creativity. The city had turned its back on its people, but some of them, the ones still breathing through the chaos, turned the collapse into culture. What didn't kill them became art, noise, movement. New York was in crisis, but something electric was crackling underneath the rubble. So was 1975 truly rock bottom for New York City? For many who lived through it, the answer is yes. Not just because of the crime or the crumbling buildings, but because of what it felt like to be abandoned by the city, by the system, by the country. When President Ford famously told the city to drop dead, it wasn't just a headline ad. It was a national confirmation of what millions of New Yorkers already felt. You're on your own. Ask anyone whose parents or grandparents lived through those days, and their memories come laced with contradictions. Yes, it was terrifying, but also real, raw. There was a kind of brutal honesty to it all. People weren't pretending. You knew who had your back and who didn't. Many speak of a sense of community born from the chaos. Neighbors who looked out for each other. Superintendents who fixed things with whatever they had. Corner stores that stayed open even when nothing else worked. Streetlights flickering. Yes, but street corners alive with noise, hustle, and grit. Life didn't stop because the city broke it adapted. Today, that New York feels like a different planet. Gleaming high-rises, $7 coffees, surveillance cameras on every block. Safe? Probably. But something's missing, and people feel it, even if they don't quite know what it is. Maybe what's missing is the edge, that mix of danger and creativity, the urgency, the resilience, a time when people didn't just live in New York, they survived it. So we ask you, did New York touch the bottom in 1975? Or was that just the city being its most honest self? Did we lose something essential when we cleaned it up? Or did we just forget the price we paid to make it livable again? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share your parents' or grandparents' stories. Because to understand what New York is today, you have to remember what it once was. Welcome to 1975. Welcome to the City of Fear.